During the summer of 2022, Russian forces who retreated from the northern Ukraine in the spring shifted their focus to the Donbas region. The war-torn part of Ukraine bears not just symbolic meaning, due to Russia's claims that they are saving the local population, which they dragged into the war in the first place, but also is a promising direction of advance. The concentration of Ukrainian forces in the region, bolstered by reinforcements deployed prior to the invasion, presents a formidable obstacle to Russian advances from the territories of DPR and LPR proxies. Since April 20, 2022, Russians have initiated a new strategic offensive, usually referred to as the Battle for Donbas, aiming to swiftly encircle and eliminate the main Ukrainian forces to open the road to further conquest of the central Ukraine. The deteriorating situation to the north in the Luhansk region, however, together with Russian local breakthroughs in Popasna, forced Ukrainians to retreat from one of the key cities, Lysichansk, at the end of June 2022. Russians, who ultimately won the battle but failed to achieve further breakthroughs towards the key cities of Sloviyansk and Kramatrosk, are determined to continue advancing to the west. Heavy urban combat in Severodonetsk and Lysichansk already cost them thousands of casualties. However, as Russians concentrated forces to the next push in the area of another mid-sized town, they are totally unaware that they are about to initiate the bloodiest battle of the 21st century. The town's name is Bakhmut. Topographically, the town with population of around 70,000 people lies in the low grounds and is split in half by the Bakhmutka river. Still, a large number of buildings makes it an important element of the eastern Bakhmut-Soledar-Siversk defensive line, which serves to protect the larger key towns of Sloviyansk and Kramatorsk. Bakhmut itself, as of July 9th, is separated from the Russian-controlled territories by a number of small villages with a northern flank anchored on the sizable city of Soledar. Around this time, the first artillery and airstrikes start reaching the city, indicating that Russians are getting closer. The same is true for Siversk, battles for which we will also cover in this video. Ukrainians initially hold the lines there with the 57th Motorized, 14th and 115th Mechanized, 128th Mountain Assault, 118th Territorial Defense Brigades, reinforced with Freedom of Russia Legion, Kostus-Kalinovsky Regiment and Sheikh Mansour Battalion. To the south, the 4th Tank, 4th National Guard and 80th Air Assault Brigades are deployed around Soledar. The 58th Motorized Brigade near Pokrovske, the 72nd Mechanized Brigade and 108th Battalion of the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade near Vershina and Vesela Dolina. They are supported by the 111th and 112th Territorial Defense and 26th Artillery Brigades. As of July 9th, the most complicated part of the front line for Ukrainians is the area around the Vuhlahirska power plant. The southern bank of the Luhansk river is fully controlled by Russian forces after the bridge across the river was destroyed. Ukrainians in the area are also under attacks from the north. Consequently, the combined force of the 30th Mechanized Brigade, with the support of the elements of the 1st Special Purpose Brigade of National Guard, is forced to take the all-around defensive position, controlling the power plant, Luhansk and Novoluhansk, with a single supply line through Semigirya, which is under constant Russian assaults from Dolomitne. Here and near Klenove, the assaults are conducted for the first time by the full PMC Wagner units that started to emerge among the rest of the Russian troops as a separate force during the battles for Severodonetsk and Lysichansk. In addition to that, to the north, Russians concentrate regiments of the 144th, 150th Motor Rifle and 76 Air Assault Divisions, together with LPR's 6th Motor Rifle Brigade and Akhmat Battalion. Siversk is primarily attacked by Wagner units, along with 2nd, 4th and 7th Motor Rifle Brigades of the LPR, which also participated in the battles for Severodonetsk and Lysichansk. At the beginning of July, Russian forces continued to accumulate near Bakhmut, with a notable increase in the size of Wagner Group, which will eventually grow from about 1,000 troops at the beginning of the war to as many as 80,000 by the time of active assaults on the city. Currently, PMC mercenaries are putting significant effort into closing the pocket around the Vuhlahirska power plant. Throughout the month, Wagner troops engage in heavy battles, assaulting Ukrainian positions and probing defenses around Soledar and Bakhmut itself. Although Ukrainians repel most of the attacks, the gradual increase in the number of troops and assaults begin to wear down the Ukrainian brigades holding the line. On July 3rd, a Russian Su-25 is shot down in the area of Lysichansk. Additionally, Near Kadiivka, Ukrainians destroy a Russian K-52 with its crew, which belonged to 319th Separate Helicopter Regiment, on July 12th. On the 19th, Wagner troops enter half of Pokrovsk, engaging in brutal urban combat with the Ukrainian 58th Motorized Brigade. Near Seversk, Ukrainians, who are still unable to fully stabilize the line after the loss of Lysichansk, initiate a fighting withdrawal from Spirne and Bilohorivka while advancing towards Verkhnyokamyanka. The situation there remained extremely fluid, with towns on the Seversk front line changing hands almost daily, as both sides conduct mechanized assaults on each other. The Russians also deploy the 18th Machine Gun Artillery Division in this direction. By July 23rd, Russians stormed Stryapivka, likely aiming to cut Soledar off Bakhmut to facilitate future assaults. Ukrainians redeploy the 108th Battalion of the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade to the area. Elements of the 80th Air Assault Brigade deployed to Soledar are replaced by the 109th Battalion of the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade. This somewhat stabilizes the situation, but by July 25th, Russians push further, entering Varshina, as the Ukrainian 72nd Mechanized Brigade stretches forces too much, preventing the encirclement at the Vuhlahirska power plant. The Ukrainian command decides to shrink the front line, withdrawing the worn-down 30th Mechanized Brigade along with elements of the 1st National Guard Brigade from the pocket. Consequently, on July 26th, Wagner troops captured the Vuhlahirska power plant after months of frontal assaults. They appeared at the power plant wearing Ukrainian uniforms, an act explicitly prohibited by the Geneva Convention, marking one of the lightest war crimes Wagner troops would commit in Ukraine. By the end of the month, Russians consolidate their positions in Pokrovsk and Stryapivka to renew the advance. As the first months of Russian strategic offensive come to an end, some conclusions can be drawn. First of all, the tactic used by Russians was significantly reshaped by Ukrainian anti-tank capabilities and the presence of drone-assisted artillery. Wagner Group, which significantly expanded to the size of approximately a whole division, uses many small infantry groups instead of the mechanized columns to break through Ukrainian defense and avoid catastrophic losses from artillery. Multiple small infantry groups usually try to flank Ukrainian positions, while some elements distract the offenders by appearing in the line of fire. Supported by the tank or BMP, infantry groups were deployed until either the position was taken or their losses became unsustainable. However, PMC is given access to the prison recruitment just in time to cover the losses of thousands of men. The owner of the Wagner, Yevgeny Prigozhin, personally visits prisons, guaranteeing pay, full amnesty after a half a year of service, and 5 million rubles in compensation for the families in the event of death. This was enough to get tens of thousands of low-quality recruits for future conquest.
Кто нам нужен? Понятно, что вы все молодцы, все нужны, но идеальный кандидат, так скажем, желательно отсидевший пятнашку и более, желательный впереди пятнашка и более, желательно не один раз за убийство, тяжкие телесные, разбой, грабеж. Нам нужны ваши криминальные таланты. Я сам отсидел 10, прежде чем стать героем России. Имею небольшое количество талантов. Они мне очень помогают в жизни. Уверен, что у многих их больше. И в конце второй недели вы пойдете в свои первые задачи по штурму окопов, укрепов, населенных пунктов или других задач.
The infantry attacks using expendable troops, such as convicts, mobilized men from occupied Donbas territories, and Russian regular units were usually followed by precise attacks from experienced Wagner veterans. PMC specialists identified and exploited weak spots in Ukrainian defenses after their adversaries reached the breaking point and revealed their positions. They also utilized more complex gear, such as armored vehicles and drones. The brutal but effective tactic allows Wagner to constantly make tactical gains, as open fields around Bakhmut are gradually more and more littered with the remains of thousands of Russian regular soldiers who were thrown into relentless assaults. Wagner also excelled in maintaining discipline, sharing videos of executions of those who failed to fulfill orders, retreated, or deserted.
Есть 3 греха, за которые расстреливаем на месте. Грех номер 1 – это дезертирство. Никто не дает заднюю.
This brutal approach compelled expendable troops to fight to the death, as they had a better chance of surviving in frontal assaults than if they retreated. On August 4th, Wagner troops started their first assaults on Bakhmut itself. Russian forces also engaged in brutal combat on the territory of the Knauf Gibbs factory, on the outskirts of Soledar. By August 6th, they break through the lines of exhausted 30th Brigade in Kodema and Travneve. However, disaster is prevented by the forces of the 72nd Brigade, which again comes to an aid and pushes Russians back, allowing the 30th Brigade to regroup and stabilize the front line. The Ukrainians, attacked from all directions by a much more numerous adversary, have to thinly spread their forces, trying to defend their positions to the south of Bakhmut, the city itself, as well as Soledar. Surprisingly, around Siversk, the situation hangs in balance for the first time in months, after the Russians take Spirne but fail to advance further. This is likely due to the arrival of the 54th Mechanized Brigade to the area. By August 9th, LPR's 6th Motor Rifle Brigade gains full control over the territory of the Knauf Gibbs factory on the outskirts of Soledar. Without Wagner reinforcements, however, they are unable to move further, as one of the most experienced Ukrainian brigades, the 80th Air Assault, holds positions there. Russians also begin frontal assaults on Yakovlivka, possibly trying to drive a wedge between Soledar and Siversk. Near Mykolaiv-Pilya, Ukrainians lose one Mi-24 that provided close air support to the infantry. On August 20th, Russians push defenders out of Vershina village, taking yet another town near Bakhmut. Meanwhile, the DPR's 3rd Brigade attacks from Horlivka, trying to renew the advance in the area of Kodema and destruct some of the Ukrainian reserves. Soldiers of the 58th Motorized Brigade on August 22nd shoot down the Russian Su-25 with Iglaman pads, filming the whole process and aftermath. Similarly to all previous incidents, the pilot does not survive, as both Ukrainian and Russian aviation flies at extremely low altitudes to avoid detection by long-range SAM systems. This, however, still makes aircraft susceptible to man-pass attacks, especially the relatively slow Su-25s that are actively used by both sides. The second month of battles for Bakhmut-Soledar-Siversk line shows that Russians stubbornly fight their way into Bakhmut and Soledar. However, to sustain the same rate of advance, Wagner, currently the main force in this direction, has to further expand in size. As Ukrainians prepare for the Kharkiv counteroffensive to the north in September, the 14th Mechanized and 80th Air Assault Brigades are gradually relocated northward. However, this does not significantly weaken the Ukrainian forces on Bakhmut axis. Over the course of the month, Russians are distracted by the complete collapse of their defense in Kharkiv region, so they mostly consolidate their positions around Bakhmut. A few ferocious attacks in the area of Zaitsevo and Odradivka are countered with the help of the 112th Territorial Defense Brigade. During the 10-day counteroffensive from September 9th to September 19th, Russians are routed from Bilohorivka and forced to form a defensive line behind the devastated town. The same is true for Spirne village, which is retaken by Ukrainians during the overall panic of Russian forces. The consequent liberation of Liman by October 1st removes the direct threat to the key towns of Sloviyansk and Kramatrosk, and significantly improves the situation around Siversk. Nevertheless, Ukrainians do not have reserves and logistics to advance indefinitely, so Lysichansk and Severodonetsk remain occupied after Kharkiv counteroffensive. This means that Bakhmut-Soledar-Siversk defensive line is still critical for protection of Sloviyansk and Kramatorsk. On September 22nd, Russians also hit and destroy a bridge inside Bakhmut with missiles, trying to degrade the defenders' logistics. Meanwhile, LPR's 7th Motor Rifle Brigade is redeployed to Soledar to regain momentum, as the LPR's 6th Motor Rifle has suffered heavy losses and is unable to advance much further than the factory on the outskirts of the town. Part of the Wagner troops that were successfully smashing into the flank near Horlivka, together with the 3rd DPR's brigade, are hastily redeployed to the Bilohorivka and Spirne area to stop the Ukrainian advance there. However, Russians still maintain the initiative along the front line as Wagner grows to approximately 20,000 men, or the size of 2 divisions, over the course of the last month. Arguably, the rapid expansion limits the potential of Ukrainian counteroffensive, as Wagner alone ties down somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 Ukrainian troops at this point. As October begins, the 93rd Mechanized Brigade is deployed to the positions in Soledar after involvement in the Kharkiv counteroffensive. Having a reputation as battle-hardened and effective unit, the redeployment of the 93rd hints that Soledar is one of the key towns, on which the whole northern flank of Bakhmut defense is anchored. The army general Sergei Surovikin, who will be known as the most prominent Prigozhin's ally in the Ministry of Defense, is appointed as a commander of the whole Russian grouping of forces in Ukraine on October 8th, amid recent failures. Later, Prigozhin will claim that exactly this day is the real start of the battle for Bakhmut, calling himself and Surovikin architects of the Bakhmut Mid-Grinder operation. Between October 7th and 9th, Wagner troops fight their way into Zaitsevo, Vesela Dolina, and Odradivka, significantly weakening the southern flank of Bakhmut. At the same time, most of the attacks to the north, and especially around Seversk, are repelled. One of the possible reasons is terrain difference. If to the south of Bakhmut, villages are located more chaotically and there are more tree lines in between them, to the north, the Ukrainian defenses are anchored on the Bilohorivka, Yakovlivka, Soledar, and Bakhmutske, which form a single line of well-reinforced towns with open fields in between. The lack of forces, and especially armored vehicles, is also a reason why defenders are driven back. While the videos from the northern flank of Bakhmut indicate heavy use of BMPs and tanks against infantry, from the southern flank, mostly drones which drop grenades on Russians are shown. The Ukrainian command tries to tackle this problem by deploying the 5th Separate Assault Regiment, 3rd Separate Marine Battalion, 62nd and 53rd Mechanized Brigades in addition to exhausted 30th Mechanized and 112th Territorial Defense Brigades. To the Bakhmut itself, the Foreign Legion, 54th Mechanized, 241st and 109th Territorial Defense Brigades, 214th Special Battalion Op 4 and 7th Center of Special Operation Forces are deployed. Soledar area, securely held by the 93rd Mechanized Brigade, is bolstered with the 71st Yager Brigade as well. All this is possible since Ukrainians no longer need these reserves in the Kharkiv direction. Arriving reinforcements temporarily halt Russian advance, but the Wagner group, far from reaching its maximum potential, already nearly doubles in the size, reaching around 40,000 men. This scale of reinforcements that Ukrainians cannot match. As it gradually happens during the course of October, on the 19th, forces of the 54th Mechanized Brigade counterattack Wagner troops near the asphalt factory plant in the city, but fail to drive the enemy back. Their adversary, however, has limited success in attempts to advance into Ivangrad and Opytne, which Ukrainians defend doggedly. Russians claim full control over the villages, but further battles in the area indicate that these claims were premature. Around October 20th, the battles for Bakhmut's southern outskirts entered the stalemate, with both sides suffering heavy losses around Opytne and Ivangrad. The Ukrainian 53rd Brigade is the main force that defends the area against waves of Wagner troops. Russians also try to distract Ukrainians by sending mercenaries in surprise assaults around Bilohorivka. Ukrainian 118th Territorial Defense Brigade, however, engages in brutal combat for the village, blocking Wagner's advance there. The redeployment likely requires Wagner commanders to swiftly move between the fronts, so they are using helicopters acquired from Belarus for that. Soldiers of the Ukrainian 54th Mechanized Brigade shoot down one Mi-8 on October 31st. After flying with severe fire on board, the helicopter hit by Man-Pat's missile finally crashes near Mykolaiivka. The incident, however, shows that Wagner employs their own transport and, as we will see later, attack aviation, which hints at full access to the vast Russian armament stockpiles. A different Bilohorivka village, the one closer to the Lysichansk, is also attacked by DPR and LPR units on November 6th, even though Russians try to exploit the fact that Seversk is defended only by the 54th Mechanized, 27th National Guard, 10th Mountain Assault, 15th Artillery Recon, 114th and 118th Territorial Defense Brigades. They failed to break through Ukrainian defenses or distract reserves from Bakhmut. By the beginning of the month, a big fraction of mechanized and armored strengths of the 93rd Brigade left, while the 24th Mechanized Brigade is expected to replace them. However, soon things will turn differently and not in Ukrainian favor. The battles around Bakhmut, due to constant artillery and airstrikes, the positional nature of warfare, and worsening weather conditions start closely resembling World War I. Kilometers of muddy trenches and burned down tree lines where Ukrainians hold the defense are assaulted by hundreds of Russians who are sent in one-way attacks through open fields. The only big difference is drones, which now allow better coordination as well as opportunity to kill attackers more efficiently with dropped explosives. These, however, do not substitute the artillery, which day and night ruins fortifications from both sides, and accounts for a significant fraction of losses, as recon drones drastically improve precision. If the arrival of the first small batches of such modern systems as Krab and PZH-2000 allow Ukrainians hit targets further and with higher degree of precision, Russians counter that with overwhelmingly superior quantities of both guns and ammunition. On November 12th, Wagner troops pushed further into Bilohorivka, engaging in heavy battles with defenders there. Ukrainians reinforced their troops with elements of the 80th Air Assault and the 81st Air Mobile Brigades for counterattack. The tactical offensive begins on November 16th with the goal of pushing Russians out of the town completely and capturing positions for further advances towards Lysichansk. After fierce fighting, Ukrainians only significantly improved their positions, as at this point the town is practically destroyed by constant artillery fire. Even though both sides will continue to contest the area, the front line near Bilohorivka will remain pretty much static for the time span covered in this video. The weather also significantly changes. The rains create mud that fills not only trenches, but also makes logistics and use of armored vehicles way harder. The heavy battles around Ivangrad and Opytne persist, as Wagner troops and forces of the 53rd Mechanized Brigade are engaged in brutal urban combat. By November 20th, the 66th Mechanized Brigade and 425th Assault Battalion Skala arrive in force to shore up the southern flank, as Russians, who after months of grueling fighting are unable to enter Bakhmut from the south, decide to turn west. Together with DPR's 3rd Brigade, Wagner troops push through weaker Ukrainian defenses there, achieving a first noticeable breakthrough in months due to element of surprise. Defenders are forced to retreat to Andriivka and Klishchiivka, as Russians flood the created wedge with expendable troops to prevent Ukrainians from stabilizing the line. Even the arrival of the elements of the 24th Mechanized and 57th Motorized Brigades from the reserves does not save the situation. By November 28th, Russians without losing momentum storm Ozaryanivka, and by the 30th enter Kurdyumivka, where they finally meet stiff resistance from the fresh Ukrainian troops. Now, it's clear that Russians, after months of tremendous losses in assaults on the city itself, found the weak spot of the Ukrainian defense to the south, which now opens the road to Chasiv Yar for them. The success of the breakthrough also relied on active use of Wagner's aviation. Consequently, they lose one Su-24M with the crew near Klishchiivka on December 2nd, due to work of the newly arrived Adam tactical group, and another bomber of the same type on the next day, near Soledar. On December 3rd, fierce battles are taking place around Kurdyumivka and further south. Meanwhile, Russians find another weak spot in the Ukrainian defense. The village of Yakovlivka to the northeast of Soledar, around which heavy battles persisted for over 6 months to a long time, was cut out from Soledar. As of December, is defended by the combination of the 1st and 2nd Rifle Battalions of the 93rd Brigade, while the 20th Mechanized Battalion defends Soledar. Shored up only by the various smaller border guard and territorial defense units, the current condition of Yakovlivka's defenders is critical. On December 7th, Russians ramp up the pressure on Yakovlivka, attacking in full force. By the 10th, it becomes clear that to drive attackers out of the village and relieve friendly forces, Ukrainians have to redeploy some of their units for a counterattack. The plan is quickly sketched out, where the 20th Mechanized Battalion has to strike one Russian flank, while the forces of the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade will attack another flank from Basele. Between December 11th and 15th, the plan is put into motion, and if the 10th Mountain Assault from its rear position is lucky enough to get to Yakovlivka, the 93rd is trapped in open field right in front of the enemy. There, Russians have been preparing in advance and zeroed in artillery, ATGMs, tanks and aviation on routes to the village. Once the 20th Mechanized Battalion steps out of the tree line, it's hit by everything, suffering heavy casualties and losing most of the vehicles. Only the arrival of the 46th Air Mobile Brigade saves the situation, preventing the complete destruction of the 20th Battalion and allowing it to retreat to the rear for replenishment with the rest of the brigade. Soledar, however, is now significantly weakened as the counterattack in Yakovlivka failed, so Russians rushed their forces into the city, almost effortlessly taking formidable positions that the 93rd Brigade was holding for over 2 months. 24th Mechanized, that had to substitute withdrawing 93rd, was deployed to the southern outskirts of Soledar, possibly due to mistake. While the situation around Yakovlivka quickly unfolded, To the south, the heavy battles persist in Kurdyumivka, from which Ukrainians were eventually pushed out. Apparently, Ukrainian command, after two counteroffensives and Russian mobilization, still decides to hold Bakhmut at any cost, as it's the only place where Russians attack head-on with huge losses. Leaving Bakhmut would mean engaging in the same bloody battles for smaller and less urbanized Chasiv Yar and Konstantinivka, but without a single defensive line of Bakhmut, Soledar, Siversk. On December 11th, Ukrainians also lost one Mi-8 of the 12th Separate Army Aviation Brigade due to an air-to-air missile fired by Russian MiG-31 in the area of Konstantinivka. All three crew members, Maxim Fedorov, Vitaly Markevich, and Vladislav Levchuk, did not survive. Russians on the 13th advanced inside Bakhmut, where mostly 71st Yager, 4th National Guard, 57th and 58th Motorized, 241st Territorial Defense Brigades hold the defense with the support of the Johar Dudayev and Sheikh Mansour battalions, as well as 40th Artillery Brigade. Wagner troops capture Champagne and Senat factories, in addition to engaging in battles around the waste sorting plant. The weather also complicates the battle conditions, especially outside the city. Many defensive positions in open fields are not heated, while the temperature drops below 0 degrees Celsius. Due to frozen ground, establishing new fortifications or expanding existing ones becomes almost impossible. Due to high humidity, dense fog forms, which often creates occasional opportunities for Russians to attack with an element of surprise. Together with strong winds, the fog also makes drones less effective, as visibility often drops to 1 to 2 kilometers, compared to almost constant 10 kilometers in the summer. All vehicles start leaving pronounced marks on the snow, which makes it easier to spot the supply lines or artillery positions. Russian successes force Ukrainians to rotate and rebalance the forces that are engaged in the defense of Bakhmut and its outskirts by the end of the year. Worn down 58th Motorized Brigade that fought around Bakhmut since June, as well as few other units, are gradually withdrawn. Instead, the city is protected by the Special Operations Forces and the newly arrived 127th, 119th Territorial Defense Brigades, in addition to 53rd Mechanized, 57th Motorized, 4th National Guard, and 71st Yager Brigades. 7th Center of Special Operation Forces is restructured into 67th Mechanized Brigade, with the 1st Mechanized Battalion called Da Vinci Wolves, after the call sign of its commander, Dmytro Kosubailo. Da Vinci is the youngest battalion commander in the Ukrainian military and the first volunteer soldier who received the Hero of Ukraine award. After the recapture of Kherson, reinforcements in the form of the 28th, 60th, 103rd Territorial Defense and 3rd Assault Brigades arrive on the southern flank of Bakhmut. They shore up 30th and 62nd Mechanized Brigades, which are engaged in ferocious battles along the whole front line. To prevent Russians from driving a wedge between Bakhmut and Soledar, Ukrainians concentrate the 24th, 63rd Mechanized, and 128th Mountain Assault Brigades around Vidgorodne. In Soledar itself, the Ukrainian command keeps the 46th Brigade shoring it up with a newly formed 77th Air Mobile, and deploys 61st Mechanized, 4th and 17th Tank Brigades. North of Yakovlivka, the 109th Battalion of the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade holds the line, and in addition, the 40th, 43rd and 45th Artillery Brigades are deployed. At the same time, the Russian command has already decided the place where they are going to attack, so in the last weeks of 2022, they accumulate forces, first and foremost, a huge number of mobilized convicts for their next move. President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, visits Bakhmut on December 20th, reinforcing the view that the city is a fortress that against all the odds still holds against Russians.
Я хочу вам подякувати за те, що ви зберегли найголовніше – землю, бажання жити, Україну, наш прапор, наші кольори. Ви абсолютно героїчні люди. Я хочу вам сказати, тут на Донбасі ви захищаєте нову Україну. Тому що після Донбасу вони все це зроблять і на інших містечках, в інших містечках нашої держави, бо вони не хочуть нічого українського. Я впевнений в цьому 100%. І тому на ваших плечах захист не Донбасу, а захист всієї України.
In a week, Kyrylo Budanov, the head of the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine, also pays a visit to boost the morale of defenders and coordinate the work of defense intelligence officers in the city. Following the formal annexation of 4 partially occupied Ukrainian regions by Russia on September 30th, the integration of local militias into Russian army started. The process finished by the end of the 2022 with all LPR's and DPR's units officially becoming parts of the Russian army with minimal changes. On January 1st, 2023, Wagner troops begin their massive assault on Soledar. Right away, the weakened Ukrainian garrison starts losing positions under the brutal onslaught. Ukrainian command, understanding that the situation is critical, by January 4th brings back the veterans of the battle, 93rd Mechanized Brigade, after a brief replenishment. Inside the city, the above-mentioned 93rd Mechanized, 77th and 46th Air Mobile, 3rd National Guard Brigades, Defense Intelligence Kraken Unit, Border Guards, volunteers, police and territorial defense are all hastily reinforcing new positions. By January 6th, Russians cross the road to Bakhmut and enter Podhorodne, breaking through Ukrainian defenses. They also expand the area of control around Yakovlivka, approaching Soledar from the east. Outnumbered Ukrainians are forced to retreat deeper into the town, completely losing Bakhmutska village and numerous positions inside the city. On the same day, Wagner troops also shot down Ukrainian Su-25 over Bakhmut. Alexander Syrsky, the commander of the Ukrainian ground forces and architect of Bakhmut defense, visits Ukrainian positions in the city on January 8th. Seeing the disaster unfolding as Russians deploy more and more troops into Soledar, there is little he can do at this point. By January 10th, the Russians reach the city center as main Ukrainian defenses were hastily organized on the western outskirts of Soledar. However, at this point, Russians simply flood the city with convicts and mobilized men who infiltrate streets and buildings in small groups despite heavy losses. One of the key strong points of the city, school number 13, is assaulted for the first time on January 11th. Russians quickly surround the building, trapping inside around 600 people, including soldiers, logisticians, medics and higher staff, all from different units. Even in these conditions, Ukrainian resolve was not broken, and the siege continued for 3 days, until the 13th, when defenders leave the school on foot through fields under the cover of the night. Many Ukrainian units in the city, flooded with quickly advancing Russian troops, were not that lucky. Disorganized and worn down Ukrainians retreat further to the Bakhmutka river, in the area of Soledar, trying to hold on to the northern outskirts of the town. At the same time, near Andriivka, mercenaries also advance through open fields, weakening defenders' positions in Klishchiivka, the fall of which will threaten one of the key supply lines of Bakhmut garrison. On January 21st, one of the Ukrainian Mi-8s that provided close air support above Bakhmut is shot down by Wagner manpads, without survivors among the crew. The capture of Soledar allows Russians to start assaults on Bakhmut from the north, further stretching the Ukrainian garrison. The loss of Soledar took a heavy toll on Ukrainian forces, as the retreat was fast and chaotic. It's also the first significant dent in Bakhmut-Soledar-Siversk line that has one of the best fortifications in the Donbas region. Wagner, however, also starts facing first problems. The meat-grinder tactic was a conscious choice of Wagner's command due to shortages of artillery ammunition. Before Ukrainian HIMARS destroyed a large fraction of ammo depots behind front lines, in Severodonetsk and Lysichansk, Russians were practically unrestricted in the number of shells used. This allowed them to capture the cities using the firewall tactic, when all positions of adversary are basically destroyed to the ground on a distance of 15 to 20 kilometers, and only after that the infantry advances into the devastated area. As Russians no longer enjoyed the enormous advantage in the number of shells, they turned to their advantage in the number of people. And this is where the meat-grinder tactic was born and deployed by Wagner. However, the losses of the notorious PMC were so enormous that at some point it was impossible to hide the casualty rates of around 80%. This negatively impacted the prison recruitment campaign. Thus, by the mid-January 2023, Wagner grew from 40 to around 50,000 men, which is way less than before. With the expansion, punitive measures for disobedience also become more evident, as Russian civilians welcome PMC's atrocities as a sign of strength, in contrast with the weak reputation of Ministry of Defense. The only group Wagner troops are more inhumane to than to their own comrades are Ukrainian prisoners of war. In January, the video filmed on December 30th surfaces, where Russians shoot a captured Ukrainian soldier of the 119th Territorial Defense Brigade, Alexander Masayevsky, for the words "Glory to Ukraine." He will be posthumously awarded the title of Hero of Ukraine. This is the most infamous, but unfortunately, one of many outright war crimes committed by Russian forces. On January 17th, Russians captured the small town of Sil, through which Bakhmut and Severodonetsk were connected. The railroad there was not used after Russian forces advanced towards Bakhmut, but the capture still shows how exactly Russians gradually cut what was a single defensive line into isolated pockets. Ukrainian 3rd Assault Brigade is redeployed to the northern part of Bakhmut, while the 4th National Guard Brigade takes its positions. As Wagner troops, after their tactical successes, suffered heavy losses, Russians start deploying their regular army units to the front line near Bakhmut. The 51st and 137th Regiments of the 106th Guards Airborne Division shore up Wagner's flank to the north, continuing the assaults in the same direction. Russian 57th Motor Rifle Brigade and 217th Airborne Regiment from the 98th Airborne Division reinforced the southern flank, allowing Wagner to focus on assaults inside Bakhmut. Artillery support is provided by the 10th Artillery Brigade of the LPR. With fresh reserves, by January 25th, Russians pushed Kastusk-Kalinovsky Regiment and other Ukrainian forces from Klishchiivka, simultaneously advancing into Krasnopolivka. On January 27th, near Kramatorsk, a Ukrainian Su-25 is shot down. The pilot of the 299th Tactical Aviation Brigade, Danilo Murashko, did not survive what was likely a missile of the Russian Su-35 fighter jet. Wagner also loses 2 high-ranking officers on January 28th, Major Alexei Dmitriev and Colonel Valentin Konovalov, which highlights the immense intensity of combat as the 7th month of the battle for Bakhmut approaches its end. On January 29th, Ukrainians are forced to abandon Blagodatne as Russians cross the Bakhmutka River, one of the few natural obstacles on the course of their advance. To reinforce the southern flank of Seversk, the Ukrainian command brings the 113th and 116th Territorial Defense Brigades to the area of Krasnopolivka on January 31st. On the next day, February 1st, Russians entered the village of Sako and Vansetti and captured Bilogorivka. The fortifications on Opetne also fall, giving Russian troops access to the Bakhmut itself from the south. The Wagner advance along Seversky-Donetsk-Donbas canal now directly threatens the key supply route from Konstantinivka. After the Russians captured Pidgorodne and engaged in heavy battles for control over Baraskoviivka, the E40 highway is no longer safe as well. The flow of supplies to Bakhmut and evacuation of wounded becomes less stable, and this further deteriorates the capabilities of Ukrainians to hold the positions. By February 5th, Russians attacked in advance pretty much on the whole front line, with the slowest pace inside the city, where brutal combat rages for each building. Under relentless fire of Ukrainian artillery and armored vehicles, only a small fraction of Wagner assault groups get to the Ukrainian positions, but over time, enough men are accumulated out of survivors to begin the attack. The 30th Brigade, that likely had to be deployed to the southern flank to take positions of the 63rd, is hastily redeployed to the northern flank, as Russians there achieve another breakthrough, taking Krasnogora village and by February 12th crossing E40 highway. The distance between two pincers is only 12 kilometers, which makes any movement in and out of Bakhmut extremely dangerous. The other consideration that significantly influences the decisions of the Ukrainian command is fate of Seversk. More specifically, since Seversk is way smaller than Bakhmut, it would take Russians less time and troops to take it. But behind Bakhmut, Ukrainians already significantly fortified Chasiv Yar, while behind Seversk there are no big towns, only a number of chaotically placed villages. Moreover, in the area of Orikhovatka, Seversky-Donetsk-Donbas canal goes into pumping station, which basically provides an easy way to cross it. At the same time, in the area of Chasiv Yar, the very same canal acts as a continuous natural defensive line. All this hints that if Russians take Seversk, they will have an easy passage to Sloviyansk and Kramatrosk, while the capture of Bakhmut will immediately force them to engage in brutal warfare against fortified positions in Chasiv Yar. Knowing this, we can argue that Ukrainians are playing alone with Russians who made a significant blunder. Of course, defenders also pay enormous price, but eventually what Russians get is tactical success, not a strategic one, that could be achieved through capturing Seversk and advancing westwards. In February, Russians likely start to understand their mistake, but they, same as Ukrainians, already invested too much into the battle for Bakhmut to leave it. Dissatisfied with Prigozhin's fame and remarks about the state of Russian armed forces, Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chief of Staff of the Russian Armed Forces Valery Gerasimov also start looking for ways to keep too powerful PMC in check. Prigozhin's former allies use their own influence to bar Wagner from recruiting from prisons, which means that PMC will inevitably shrink and reaching the military goals will be much harder. On February 13th, the Russian Air Force Su-24M is damaged by Piorun pads over Bakhmut. The crew working for Wagner has managed to land the burning aircraft back at the base. On the next day, the Russian command concentrates LPR's Force 6 and DPR's 123rd Motor Rifle Brigades to the south of Severodonetsk for advance towards the city. Simultaneously, Russians also attack Spirne, Bilohorivka and push from Zolotarivka. The rivers near Severodonetsk, however, helped Ukrainians to hold their ground against Russians, and no progress in the direction of the key city is made. By February 18th, Ukrainians retreat from Paraskoviivka due to danger of encirclement. They put all their efforts into preventing Russian breakthroughs to Ivanivsk and Kromove, since the roads there are the only supply routes for Bakhmut garrison. The deployment of the 5th Separate Assault Regiment and 80th Air Assault Brigades on the southern flank is the measure of last resort. In heavy mechanized assaults to the south of Ivanivsk, Ukrainians conduct a number of counterattacks, inflicting massive losses on the 137th Guards Airborne Regiment of the 106th Airborne Division and Wagner troops, stabilizing the situation. Russians, however, still advance inside Bakhmut. Ukrainian 93rd Mechanized Brigade and other units usually counter their assaults by sending tank or BMP to the location of a breakthrough to methodically destroy the captured position. This tactic works well, as usually Wagner assault groups pack into small houses that are easily shredded by autocannons and tank guns. However, soon Russians adapt to it, starting to destroy Ukrainian vehicles, so as the battle progresses, infantry on foot still plays the dominant role in the offense and defense. The high-rise buildings that Wagner troops can use for more effective fighting are also mined by Ukrainians upon retreat and blown up with adversary troops inside, indicating a shift to using elements of scorched earth strategy for the sake of inflicting maximum casualties on advancing enemy. Russians answer by using their tanks and AGGMs in the city, as well as TOS-1 thermobaric MLRS to devastate Ukrainian positions. At this point, Wagner concentrated their core, professional mercenaries inside Bakhmut, to achieve progress, so unlike convicts, these troops utilize all range of Russian weapons with high efficiency. Under onslaught, Ukrainians are also forced to retreat from the northern flank, losing Verkhivka and engaging in heavy battles inside Yagidne on February 24th. Currently, this is the only place where Russians still make significant territorial gains outside the city, but each captured kilometer is significant due to proximity of key supply routes. On the next day, Ukrainians retreat from Yagidne. Sensing a close victory, Wagner troops focus all their efforts solely on breaking through the Ukrainian northern flank, in the area of Berkhivka. On February 27th, they achieved the necessary concentration of forces, flooding Ukrainian positions with troops and forcing defenders to retreat. In these relentless attacks, one of the Wagner officers with prior experience in the Russian Rapid Reaction Unit GROM, Major Alexander Gorodilov, is killed. Nevertheless, a significant breakthrough to the outskirts of Kromove further degrades Ukrainian logistics. Currently, the distance between two pincers is only 4 kilometers. This makes the existing supply route the only road of life to and from Bakhmut. The assault is another tactical success for Russians, but losses force them to slow down. Ukrainians on both the southern and northern flanks are also pressed back to back around the key road, which creates a stiffer defense. Inside Bakhmut, a similar situation occurs as Ukrainians are pushed to the Bakhmutka river, but continue brutal urban fighting in a concrete jungle under constant artillery strikes. Of course, defenders also respond with artillery and air strikes, but on much smaller scale, since Ukraine possesses neither enough shells nor enough planes. Nevertheless, the Ukrainian Air Force, which already lost many assets around Bakhmut, continues minimal close air support with Su-24s and Su-25s. On March 1, 2023, one Su-24M from the 7th Tactical Aviation Brigade is shot down near Drushkivka while returning from the mission. Both crew members, Viktor Volynets and Igor Solomenikov, did not survive. As of March 3rd, Wagner troops control the northeastern part of the Bakhmut up to the Bakhmutka river. Russian missiles also destroy bridge in Kromove, which severely degrades logistics. Russians also attack in the private sector on the south and southeast of Bakhmut, where Ukrainians employ the Georgian Legion, 1st, 3rd and 4th National Guard, Lute and Presidential brigades, and some smaller formations such as Shaman, Kraken and Kabul 9 Special Operation Units of Defense Intelligence, as well as Johar Dudaev, Sheikh Mansour and Border Guards battalions. All these forces are used to saturate every building in the city with defenders and inflict maximum casualties on Russians. However, these units are unable to establish a solid defense because they lack coordination. Instead, they are used for so-called free hunt, where the end goal is to eliminate as many enemies as possible instead of holding the particular line of defense. The tactic is a double-edged sword, as on the one hand, it makes Ukrainians inevitably lose ground at a higher rate. On the other hand, after the fall of Soledar and the critical situation with supply lines, the best outcome Ukrainians can realistically expect is gradual orderly withdrawal while inflicting such high losses on the Russians that they cannot rout or encircle the defenders. Where the ground really matters is the area of Kromove, through which the last road to Bakhmut passes. The videos show a ferocious fighting of Honor Company of the 1st Da Vinci Rules Battalion of the 67th Mechanized Brigade, who take an all-round defense in one of the devastated tree lines near the Road of Life. Other elite units like volunteer battalions Sonishko and Stugna stand back-to-back with regular soldiers of the 92nd Mechanized and 3rd Assault Brigades. After coordinating the repulsion of another massive assault on the road to Kromove, the battalion commander of the 67th Mechanized Brigade, Dmitro Kosyubailo with call sign Da Vinci, returns to Chasiv Yar, where a sudden Russian artillery barrage takes his life on March 7th. The legendary commander, whose contribution to the defense of Bakhmut and other numerous operations is hard to overestimate, was only 27 years old. Prior to that, under similar circumstances in Chasiv Yar, Major Andriy Lukanyuk is killed. He was the famous commander of the Air Mobile Battalion of the Ukrainian 80th Air Assault Brigade, and the veteran of many battles since 2014. By March 10th, Ukrainians are forced to retreat from the whole left bank of Bakhmutka River, as even a minor breakthrough of the Russians to the right bank can create an encirclement for defenders, who has limited opportunities for maneuvers. By March 12th, Russians engaged in a brutal assault on a large metal processing plant. The attacks on well-prepared Ukrainian positions in the industrial infrastructure reminds us of Stal assaults. However, in this case, Ukrainians have managed to prevent a complete encirclement, as well as keep Russian aviation in check by manpads. The functional artillery, added to the above-mentioned factors, make a factory assault a nightmare for Wagner troops, but without choice, they push further. Since on the southern outskirts of Bakhmut, there are no big industrial buildings, but only small residential houses, Russian advance there proceeds much faster. The area of the corridor to Bakhmut is held by 80th Air Assault, 77th Air Mobile, 56th Motorized, 67th and 92nd Mechanized Brigades, and volunteer units, Sonishko and Stugna, as well as 5th Separate Assault Regiment. With the support of the 107th Rocket Artillery Brigade, these forces are sufficient to stop Russian paratroopers from advancing. Moreover, Ukrainian counterattacks along the supply route effectively eliminate arriving VDV forces. On March 12th, one of such counterattacks is filmed. It features one American M113 APC, which transports a group of the 5th Assault Regiment's soldiers right to the trench. While APC provides suppressive fire, Ukrainian infantry disembarks and engages the trench with small arms and thermobaric grenade launcher. After Russians are suppressed by Browning machine gun and start running away from their positions, Ukrainians enter the trench, clearing the path forward with grenades. The Russian troops, which gathered in the end of the trench, feel lucky that they escaped, but a Ukrainian tank swiftly approaches their position, eliminating the Russians with one accurate shot into the trench. After that, drone pilots of Adam Tactical Group finish the remaining infantry here with thermobaric grenades dropped from the drones. After the assaults, any further advance of the Russian forces towards Ivanivsky in this sector is stopped, as massive casualties take their toll. On March 15th, a Russian Su-25 is shot down by soldiers of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade, near Bakhmut. The pilot, reportedly a Wagner PMC contractor, ejected safely. In just 2 weeks, a Su-24M piloted by Wagner contractors is shot down near Klishivka, with at least one of 2 crew members killed. By March 16th, Russians take control over the part of the metal processing plant in Bakhmut, while also advancing into Zalizhnyansk and from Dubovo-Vasilievka. However, they are stopped on the outskirts of Bogdanivka by the 67th Brigade and Skala Battalion. At the same time, Yevgeny Prigozhin starts voicing concerns about the situation around Bakhmut. He claims that the slowdown in progress is due to inability of Russian regular army units to cover the Wagner's flanks. so there is a chance that Ukrainians can launch a successful counterattack to improve their positions around the city. As many Ukrainian brigades were recently redeployed to Bakhmut, his concerns are somewhat reasonable, but by the most part, Wagner's chief simply tries to attract attention to his problems. It's worth keeping in mind that for Prigozhin, who himself claimed that he doesn't understand the motives of the war in Ukraine, the whole Bakhmut campaign is mere PR and commercial project. However, as Prigozhin starts being more and more vocal about the incompetence of the Russian military command, it becomes clear that he does not like how things turned out.
Кто виноват в том, что они погибли? Виноваты те, кто должны были решить вопрос о снабжении нас достаточным количеством боеприпасов. Финальная подпись должна ставиться либо Герасимова, либо Шойгу. Ни один из них не хочет принимать решения. Если бы соответствующие лица подготовили армию и делали все, что они обязаны были делать последние 10 и более лет, то ЧВК «Вагнер» вообще было бы не нужно. А наверху сидят, вероятнее всего, сидят просто совершенно оборзевшие граждане, которые думают, что страна создана для того, чтобы они удовольствие и почести получали.
Big fraction of Wagner troops, his main resource, are lost after months of heavy assaults. It's estimated that out of 40,000 prisoners recruited in the second half of 2022, only about 10,000 continued their service at the end of January 2023. Wagner's reputation hampers recruiting to the point where PMC allegedly buys Russian soldiers from other units to use them in their assaults. This puts Wagner's chief between rock and hard place, where the first stages of the battle allowed him to accumulate money, fame, and influence for his private military company, while the later stages brought it to the brink of collapse. The conflict between Prigozhin and the Ministry of Defense also starts brewing, as both sides find each other simultaneously being allies and rivals. On March 22nd, two Wagner officers are killed, Lieutenant Colonels Andrei Smirnov and Roman Bocharov. By March 24th, Russians advance along E40 highway, but are unable to connect to pincers of encirclement due to Ukrainian determined resistance. At the metal processing plant, one of the hangars is also captured. Ukrainians have miraculously managed to stabilize the situation around the supply routes, which caused them significant number of troops, but the Bakhmut garrison receives minimal supplies to function, and even upon retreating, inflicts heavy casualties on advancing troops. However, the fate of Bakhmut is already clear. On March 26th, Ukrainians under relentless Russian assaults abandoned their positions in the metal processing plant, retreating deeper into the city. In comparison to the ferocious fighting, for the road of life or inside Bakhmut, it may seem like near Severodonetsk not much happens. However, both Ukrainians and Russians there also contest each tree line. For example, the famous K2 battalion of the 54th Mechanized Brigade is fighting its way into captured T-shaped position, which changed hands multiple times. Its significant objective, as from there, Russians plan to take Verkhnyokamyansk, the last village that shields Seversk from direct assault. Previously, Russians already attacked Verkhnyokamyansk, but the Ukrainian artillery dispersed most of the infantry groups. Now, however, it's time for Ukrainians to attack. They sent two T-72 tanks with call signs Sokol and Kochevnik, accompanied by BMP-2 Moria. The tanks, communicating with each other and drone operators, quickly cross the field and take positions on two sides of the artificial rectangular hill. Now, as both tanks protected their vulnerable side armor, they opened fire with high explosive fragmentation shells into the tree line with Russians. After a few accurate shots, Sokol notices a bright flash of launched ATGM at his tank, and the crew intentionally hits not the tree line, but the ground in front to obscure the tank for missile operator. This decision saves Sokol, as Russian ATGM misses the tank. Unlike Kochevnik, who continues to harass infantry in trenches from the distance, Sokol starts to move forward and maneuver to increase the chances of dodging the next missile. Eventually, moving from the kill zone, the tank drives right into the tree line, continuing to lay accurate shots into the trenches filled with infantry. One of the Russian soldiers throws a grenade, which lands quite far away from the tank, but crew's reaction is lightning fast, as the tank lays the next shell right into the trench where the grenade came from. After that, Sokol crew decides to seal the fate of any survivors, driving over the trench and burying alive anyone who survived the shells. In the risky move, the tank almost gets stuck, but the driver eventually leaves the destroyed trench. As a sign of excellent communication, just as Sokol leaves the devastated objective, BMP-2 arrives, dropping the infantry that captures the T-shaped position. T-72 with call sign Kochevnik also leaves the position unharmed after pounding Russian trenches. By April 1st, Wagner troops try to encircle defenders in the city center, but as long as positions in the area of Avangard Stadium and to the north of Railroad Station stand, Ukrainians simply retreat to the next house after defending the current one becomes impossible. On April 2nd, Yevgeny Prigozhin declares that Wagner troops captured Bakhmut. The Wagner's flag is raised on the half-destroyed city administration at night. However, Prigozhin also acknowledges that in the western part of the city, Ukrainian troops continue to hold the defense. Thus, PMC's job is not done yet. At this point, Russians have no progress on the flanks around the city, as Wagner forces put all their efforts into significantly slowed down but still steady advance inside Bakhmut. They are assisted by newly formed Storm Z units, which were formed by Ministry of Defense mostly out of convicts, using the Wagner's units as a template. Usually, these are attached to regular Russian army forces as an expendable element, as recruits get around 10 to 15 days of training before being sent to the front line. Ukrainian forces, extremely worn down, continue to fall back. By April 4th, Russians capture positions closer to the railroad, and by the 9th, both the Metallurg and Avangard stadiums with adjacent buildings. Particularly near Metallurg Stadium, Ukrainians get surrounded, and task force of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade is deployed to get them out, numbering 3 BMPs, 2 tanks and Medevac M113, an IRV, and a number of MRAPs and armored cars. They spearhead towards the stadium along Gorbatova Street. There, Ukrainians engage in heavy combat, losing BMP and Humvee. All other vehicles also sustain damage, but eventually task force completes an evacuation of surrounded friendly forces. They retreat back under the cover of tanks, one of which is famous vehicle nicknamed Zaika. Captured in Kharkiv region by Ukrainians, the T-80 BVM was put into action many times against its former owners, destroying many Russian tanks and BMPs. Under the command of the tanker with call sign Vorchun, Zaika covers the retreat, but at the last moment gets stuck in the ditch under heavy fire. The crew has to abandon their trophy and destroy it to prevent the capture by Russians, ending the story of one of the most famous tanks that Ukraine captured from Russia and subsequently put into action. Defenders are further forced to withdraw to the railroad, taking positions there. On April 5th, a Russian Mi-24 is shot down by servicemen of the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade near Berestova. Both crew members from the 112th Separate Helicopter Regiment did not survive. By April 11th, Prigozhin officially confirms that Wagner troops concentrate solely on the battles inside the city, while the flanks around are given to the units of Russian armed forces, namely VDV. This signals about the significant shortage of men that Wagner faces, as before that, mercenaries were able to conduct assaults around the whole Bakhmut-Soledar-Sivaysk line. This is not surprising news, especially as not only convicts take losses, but even senior Wagner commanders, like Major Maxim Bushmakin, who was killed on April 15th. As a veteran of the Chechen and Dagestan wars, with 5 deployments, he was likely a high-ranking officer, even though, to this day, the internal command structure of Wagner is not fully clear. In a week, 2 of his colleagues from PMC are killed as well. On April 17th, Ukrainians, after retreating from the People's House and making sure Russians took positions inside, detonated preemptively mined building. During the heavy battle for Road of Life, on April 21st, Russians briefly blocked it, capturing key positions. Fortunately for the city garrison, the forces of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade, stationed nearby, in a number of counterattacks deblocked the supply route by approximately April 25th. On April 24th, the Ukrainian Air Force drops 4 GBU-62 JDAM glide bombs on a high-rise building in the Russian-controlled part of Bakhmut from 2 MiG-29s. Since such rare weapons are used, Ukrainians likely target either Wagner command or just a big number of troops inside the building. By this time, Russians advanced both from the north and east, but overall slow progress allowed Ukrainians to conduct an orderly withdrawal in most of their positions. By the end of the month, Ukrainians control a small piece of the city, establishing positions in the high-rise buildings on the eastern outskirts. On May 2nd, Yevgeny Prigozhin releases a video complaining that there is a shortage of ammunition, with his forces needing 300 tons a day to sustain an advance.
У нас нехватка боеприпасов!
70%! Шойгу! Герасимов! Где боеприпасы?
On May 5th, due to the absence of any reaction from the Russian Ministry of Defense, the head of the Wagner publicly threatens that he would withdraw all Wagner personnel from the city by May 10th.
Месяц назад нам прекратили выдавать боеприпасы, и мы получаем не более 10%. С 10 мая 23 года мы выходим из населенного пункта Бахмут.
He further denounces Sergei Shoigu, Minister of Defense, and Valery Gerasimov, the Chief of General Staff, saying that in the absence of ammunition, Wagner personnel are doomed to perish.
Вот на сегодняшний день мы приходим к тому, что ЧВК «Вагнер» заканчивается. И ЧВК «Вагнер» через какое-то короткое время перестанет существовать. Мы уйдем в историю. Ничего страшного.
The battles, however, persist, as by May 3rd, Wagner mercenaries assault high-rise buildings with the support of recently arrived to Bakhmut 57th Motor Rifle Brigade soldiers. With minimal progress inside the city and completely stationary encirclement pincers, Russians put all their efforts into pushing Ukrainians out of the last unoccupied district. They also employ large quantities of incendiary munitions against Ukrainian positions on that day. However, this does not significantly affect the defenders who hold on to concrete buildings. Moreover, on the flanks of Bakhmut, Ukrainians increased the number of counterattacks, starting to gradually take back lost positions. As a result, yet another Wagner major, a veteran of the Chechen wars, Sergei Yemelyanov, is killed in action. On May 7th, Prigozhin also announces that the artillery ammunition flow was resumed, so Wagner forces would remain in Bakhmut, as the Sergei Surovikin would be acting as an intermediary between Wagner and the Russian Ministry of Defense.
Убивают наших солдат, а счастливый дедушка думает, что ему хорошо. И как выиграть войну, если вдруг случайно, я просто предполагаю, окажется, что этот дедушка законченный мудак.
On May 9th, the newly arrived Russian 72nd Motor Rifle Brigade, formed from men mobilized in spring, tries to replace withdrawn VDV forces on the southern flank of encirclement. In brutal combat with the Ukrainian experienced 3rd Assault Brigade, Russians are routed after suffering enormous casualties. Ukrainians declare that the 6th and 8th companies of the 72nd Brigade are completely destroyed.
Поэтому у нас армия бежит. Бежит, потому что 72-я бригада сегодня просрала 3 квадратных километра, на которых у меня погибло порядка 500 человек, потому что это был стратегический плацдарм. Они просто взяли и драпанули.
By May 12th, Ukrainians further retreat inside Bakhmut from relatively open areas with a group of densely placed high-rise buildings. A determined counterattack of elements of the 92nd, 67th Mechanized and 57th Motorized Brigades forces Russians to retreat from their positions near Botanivka. By May 13th, Russians are pushed from positions near Severodonetsk Donbas Canal, Ivanivske and Grigorievka. Particularly in Klishchiivka, former LPR's 4th Motor Rifle Brigade runs away from the positions after suffering enormous casualties, including its commander, Colonel Vyacheslav Makarov, and Deputy of Chief of Staff of the 2nd Army Corps, Colonel Yevgeny Brovko. At the same time, Yevgeny Prigozhin releases a video where he once again calls out the incompetence of the Russian military and outlines his vision of Ukrainian and Russian plans. First of all, he claims that the attack on Bakhmut was a diversionary move to lock as many Ukrainian forces as possible in the brutal combat with Wagner, while Russian regular units had to break through Siversk. He also claims that since Russian military command failed to do so, all efforts were futile.
Мы должны были, воспользовавшись тем, что мы взяли Сака Иванцетти, Николаевку, подошли вплотную к Раздоловку, выйти вот вдоль этой дороги и подрезаться до Северска. Отрезав достаточно большую часть и обезопасив Лисичанск и Северодонецк. Для этого нам, к сожалению, подрезали людей, и мы это сделать не смогли, а военные по какой-то причине туда не двинулись.
And currently, Ukrainians successfully hold not key towns, but key high grounds in the area of Bakhmut. This will give defenders a better control over the area, and while Russian command will be focused on holding the towns, the Russian flanks will be cut to pieces by Ukrainian counterattacks from high grounds. Prigozhin acknowledges that PMC currently operates only in the streets of Bakhmut and does not have enough men to shore up the flanks, which are held by regular army units. His predictions about the whole collapse of the Bakhmut front are nothing but a severe dramatization, as Ukrainians are preparing for their summer counteroffensive, thus concentrating most of their reserves on the southern front. Nevertheless, the situation definitely spirals out of Wagner's chief control, as the divide between him and his main sponsor, the Ministry of Defense, grows every day. By May 14th, Wagner troops drive a wedge between 2 out of 3 Ukrainian last sectors of defense inside the city. On the next day, sectors Gniezdo and Konstruktor are further separated as Russians run into fortifications of the Domino sector of defense. By the 17th, Ukrainians further retreat to the high-rise buildings of Domino. By May 20th, they are pushed from these positions as well, organizing defenses outside the city. On that day, Yevgeny Prigozhin declared that officially started on October 8th, Wagner's operation Bakhmut Meat Grinder is over.
20 мая 23 года, 20.05.2023. Сегодня по полудню в 12 часов полностью был взят Бахмут.
According to him, it took 224 days, or 7.5 months, to take the city, and this estimate ignores the shaping operations started in July, which bumps the full duration of the battle to astonishing 10 months. Meanwhile, Ukrainians make further progress on the flanks, where the 4th Motor Rifle Brigade had to hastily take positions of the flat 72nd Brigade. As Ukrainians attempt to advance on the northern flank as well, Russians deploy the 9th Motor Rifle Regiment of the 18th Motor Rifle Division and 200th Motor Rifle Brigade. After that, Ukrainian forces of the Presidential Brigade are seen in the private sector near the Plain Monument, but by the end of the month, Russians establish complete control of the city, or rather of what was left of it. On May 25th, Prigozhin promises to withdraw all Wagner forces from the Bakhmut and transfer full control to the Russian units by June 1st. After that, the front line near Bakhmut becomes mostly stationary, with a few successful tactical counterattacks by Ukrainians at the beginning of June. To draw proper conclusions from all the events of the bloodiest battle of the 21st century, we have to discuss 3 separate things. First is how on tactical, operational and strategic levels the assault of the city was conducted. Coming back to the origins, the battle for Bakhmut can be seen as a part of the battle for Donbas, as after seizing Severodonetsk and Lysichansk, Russians did not reach the main goal, encirclement and destruction of potent Ukrainian forces in the region. In this regard, the battle for Bakhmut was certainly more successful than battle for Severodonetsk and Lysichansk from the Russian point of view, which we will discuss in this next section of conclusions dedicated to casualties. However, strategically, hostilities around the city worked as a magnet for Ukrainian forces. We mentioned dozens of Ukrainian ground forces and National Guard brigades, border guard special operations and volunteer units who took part in the battle. These forces were constantly engaged in defending Bakhmut and its surroundings, so significant forces were diverted from other Ukrainian offensives. With this, the strategic meaning of Fortress Bakhmut, as Ukrainians call it, or Bakhmut Meat Grinder, as Russians call it, ends. Having the benefit of hindsight, we can see that partially due to the way Wagner fought, the fall of Bakhmut resulted in further stalemate in the area and no breakthrough. As mentioned before, the Siversk direction was possibly a better candidate for the axis of advance, but Wagner attacked arguably the most reinforced area of the Bakhmut-Soledar-Siversk line head-on, losing so much time and troops that key towns of Sloviyansk and Kramatrosk are now defended along reinforced Toretsk-Chasiv-Yar-Siversk line. On the tactical and operational level, Wagner was using 2 main tools, one of which is not new, massive artillery bombardments, also called the firewall tactic. The other one was a tactic of numerous small infantry groups. The lower were stockpiles of Russian artillery ammunition, the more convoys were sent in small groups towards Ukrainian positions to try to take them by sheer numbers. This approach worked fairly well, but eventually even Prigozhin himself admitted that his PMC was annihilated this way, to the point where Wagner had enough troops to attack only on the narrow front and had to immediately withdraw after Bakhmut was captured. Therefore, as much as Wagner's tactic was effective, it was unsustainable in the long run. As to just reach the Dnipro River, dozens of towns like Bakhmut have to be captured. Moreover, what Wagner actually conquered is not a city, but empty ruins with around 500 people left out of 70,000, and with all infrastructure in the industry completely destroyed. It's quite a stretch to say that anyone really gained anything out of the capture of Bakhmut, so an even more accurate name for the battle than Prigozhin's Bakhmut meat grinder would be the annihilation of Bakhmut. Another angle, and the most complicated one from which we have to analyze the battle, is casualties. Ukrainian officials reported staggering losses for the Russians, claiming 21,000 killed and approximately 60,000 wounded, totaling to around 80,000 casualties. This aligns closely with statements from Yevgeny Prigozhin, who acknowledged recruiting 50,000 prisoners, in addition to regular contract soldiers, with around 20% killed among convicts, which is 10,000 men, and the same number of killed in action for contractors. Considering Wagner's peak strength of 80,000 personnel, reduced to 25,000 by summer 2023, it's plausible that up to 50,000 were wounded. Further investigations by Russian journalists also support this data, as they claim that 48,000 convicts were recruited. But out of the total of 19.5 thousand men killed in action, 17.2 thousand were prisoners, and the rest were free mercenaries. US officials in May also named similar numbers, claiming that on Bakhmut front, 20,000 Russian soldiers were killed in combat and 80,000 wounded. At the same time, Wagner's chief mentioned that around 50,000 Ukrainian troops were killed in action and around 60,000 wounded during the battle for Bakhmut. However, according to the Ukrainian president, by February 24, 2024, Ukraine in total lost 31,000 troops as killed in action, which is more or less consistent with Western estimates, so the more reasonable estimate is up to 12,000, as Ukrainian officials also claimed that for every 7.5 Russian soldiers lost, Ukraine lost a single serviceman. Western estimates give 20,000 of wounded and killed. Of course, all these numbers are manipulative and do not really reflect the real losses, but what is clear is that Russians lost multiple times more than Ukrainians did, while claiming the opposite. And finally, we can discuss the aftermath of the battle. As we said, due to enormous efforts of Ukrainians, no strategic shift in favor of Russia has happened. The Ukrainian 2023 counteroffensive that fell short of its goals was definitely negatively affected by the battle for Bakhmut, but in a separate video about it, we outline more important reasons why Ukrainians did not succeed there. For Ukrainians, the battle for Bakhmut became a bitter defeat that claimed lives of far too many, as all thinkable and unthinkable efforts were poured into defending the high-rise buildings within the city, the industrial infrastructure of Soledar, the small villages surrounding the agglomeration, and the road through Hromove, littered with charred remains of armored vehicles. Meanwhile, Prigozhin, receiving the praises for victory in Bakhmut from Vladimir Putin and the Russian public, withdraws what was left of his troops from the city in 5 days, clearly no longer planning to participate in such gambles. Instead, he decides to play his own game in order to at least remove his vis-a-vis from Ministry of Defense or even usurp power in Russia. He launches Wagner insurrection on June 23rd, about which we already made a separate video. The uprising, however, reaches the anticlimactic end. After almost getting to the Moscow with his loyal soldiers, Prigozhin takes the deal with Putin and stops, which eventually precipitates into his plane falling apart in the skies above Russia in just a month after the rebellion. After that, PMC Wagner still exists, but is a mere shadow of itself with no contribution to the war in Ukraine. Thus, the battle for Bakhmut clearly became a trap for Prigozhin, escaping from which did cost him his private military company and ultimately his life, after he was put on a collision course with Russian Ministry of Defense. For Russia as a whole, the battle for Bakhmut is undeniably a Pyrrhic victory. Where the annihilated city, the losses inflicted on Ukrainian armed forces, and the time won came at an overwhelming and crippling cost, leaving behind nothing but a hollow triumph steeped in devastation.